home office slash basement slash storage room. So ignore what's going on behind me. But anyway, today I want to talk to you a little bit about mental health and suicide prevention and just overall wellness and well-being. So, as I believe I said it, my name is Josh. I work at Zimmer Valley Health Center, and for the past 3 years, I have been the regional suicide prevention coordinator. And so I go around and I educate individuals on suicide prevention. I teach people how to ask about suicide, warning signs or potential warning signs, and then how to persuade someone to get help and how to make an effective referral. I also supervise a mobile crisis team, and so I educate individuals on crisis intervention. And today, I want to talk with you about how you can support your peers as well as build some resilience to help manage and mitigate stressors in your life. Now, before I do that, I also want to share a bit of my lived experience. And the reason I do that is not to make things about me, but it is to encourage you, and if you're struggling, to let you know that you're not alone. I'm in recovery, and this November I will be sober for 8 years. So now it's been a battle, especially during COVID and stress, right? But I also have generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and I am a suicide survivor, meaning I lost someone, specifically my stepfather, to suicide when I was 15 years old. A year later, I nearly became a statistic in my own suicide attempt. Now, we ought not to be afraid to talk about our mental health or the things that we experience. One of the biggest myths is that if we talk about suicide, that we're going to plant seeds, right? Well, the reality is that those seeds are already there. And by having these conversations, we actually start to destigmatize the subject matter. Now, we're not talking just about suicide today. So let's get into some mental health. When we look at mental health, we all have it, right? Just like we all have physical health. Now, one of the things is that when we say mental health, we typically gravitate towards a negative connotation such as depression, anxiety. We don't necessarily think of a joy, gratitude, flourishing, and wellness, right? As to where if I said let's talk about physical health, we would think we're going to talk about exercise and nutrition. So there's definitely work to be done. But I want to distinguish between a mental health emergency and a mental health crisis. A mental health emergency is when someone is in immediate risk to themselves and or others around them. A mental health crisis is simply a deviation in our baseline, and that's going to look different from person to person. So some potential clues that someone may be in a crisis are they may be struggling, right? That they might be, if someone is academically focused, their focus and effort may start to wane. Perhaps they become a little bit more isolated, or they lose enjoyment in previously pleasurable activities such as athletics, hanging out with friends, any kind of hobby. It could be exercising, reading, whatever the case might be. Someone may have random bouts of crying, or they might be irritable. Right? People may act out, they may skip school. Typically, deviation of baseline is something that's out of character. And so when I struggle with my anxiety, if my anxiety is bothering me, I tend to be a little bit more on the quiet side. I really don't want to engage socially, although it is a good distraction from whatever I'm experiencing physiologically and psychologically. Now, again, I've also struggled with depression at times in my life. I haven't felt depressed for a very long time, thankfully. But during those times, too, some of my biggest coping skills are exercise, reading, talking, right? Feeling down in the blues, so to speak. I didn't find enjoyment in any of those things. And so when you look to your left, you look to your right, when you think about your friends, your teammates, your coaches, even your teachers, right? When you see a prolonged deviation or change in someone's behavior, it can be a warning sign or potential clue that they might be experiencing some mental health related struggles. And it doesn't take much for us to experience mental health related struggle, right? Because mental health is our psychological well-being. And we all have that within us, right? Mental illness, it is illness that is organic in nature. So we actually see physiological changes in the brain, chemical imbalances, and that sort of thing. Now, let's talk about depression and anxiety. You can feel anxious and not have anxiety. Now, I want you to think about this. Have you ever felt nervous before getting your license, before a date, before a big test, before an athletic event? On a smaller scale, that is what anxiety feels like. Now, have you ever felt deep sadness, right? Low motivation. That is very akin to depression. I mean, you can feel depressed without having clinical depression. Now, how do we help someone who's struggling? First and foremost, we aren't therapists. I'm not a therapist, right? So it's not our job to necessarily provide feedback. So one of the most important things we can do is we can ask. So if you see a peer, let's just say, for example, that you have a friend, and perhaps their home life is a little bit chaotic right now. Maybe the parents are going through a divorce, and you notice that maybe their energy levels are a little bit off, meaning they're not as engaged with you, their academics. Well, you can ask, hey, look, divorces are tremendously stressful. And I know that sometimes when people go through these situations that they can experience depression, and I'm wondering if you might feel as if you're depressed. Or we can simply ask, hey, I'm a little bit concerned about you right now. Will you talk with me? Right? And what that does is, again, we're not providing therapy, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to see what's going on with the person. We want to inquire about their state of well-being. And if someone says to you, yeah, I'm feeling down, because you are going to be a green bandana advocate, you'll have resources to hand out. But that doesn't mean you just say, hey, okay, you're struggling, here's a card with resources, please use these. Absolutely want people to use resources, but you can also listen. Now, one of the things about listening is that oftentimes we listen to respond. Right? And so as we're having a conversation, our brains are thinking faster than we can speak. And we're coming up with advice, and I'm going to say this to what they said, and we need to put that at bay. And we want to listen to really understand. And a great way to listen to understand is called active listening. You basically reiterate what the person said to you the way you understood it. So if I'm having a conversation with you and you tell me, Josh, look, I'm struggling academically. I have some things going on in my home life that are troublesome, and I'm going through a breakup, and I'm really not feeling well. I would say something to the effect of, correct me if I'm wrong, but due to all the stressors in life, it sounds like, you might be feeling a little bit depressed. Right? You can put your own twist on it, but we want to make sure we try to ask open-ended questions. We want to talk to people in private. And also, we want to make sure that we get people to the right resources. This is your resiliency specialist. This is your school-linked social worker, mental health therapist. Right? One of the, specifically more sort of suicide, but also this works for if someone just notes that they're struggling mentally, psychologically, emotionally. We don't necessarily want to keep that a secret per se. Right? If someone says, hey, look, I would be better off dead, don't keep that to yourself. Now, I'm not saying go tell your friends. Don't tell your friends. But it's important that you talk with someone. Talk with someone who can help them. Because you might not be equipped to handle the situation. It's not your responsibility to necessarily help guide them through their struggles. But a trained professional can provide effective assistance. Now, I've worked with people before, and I've heard it many times where a friend has said to another friend, hey, look, I'm thinking about suicide. Or perhaps their friend has been engaging in self-injurious behavior, and they keep it to themselves, right? They keep that secret, and unfortunately, the person who is engaging in the behavior ends up dying from a suicide attempt, or an accidental suicide attempt where they cut too deep. And so you want to be very mindful of that. Sure, your friend may be a little bit upset with you. Short term, you may feel as if you're betraying trust, but that act is actually done out of love and care. And hopefully in due time, they'll come to see that. When we talk about resources, there's all kinds of different resources. There's the crisis text line. You can text MN to 741-741. There's crisis response in southeastern Minnesota. You can reach them at 844-274-7472. There's the Trevor hotline. I don't have the number offhand. And actually, it's called the Trevor Project. But if you go into Google and you type the Trevor Project, you can find their website. This is a resource for LGBTQ plus youth aged 24 and under. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Also coming soon to Rochester is CIRC, Southeastern Regional Crisis Center. This is going to be a crisis center for youth and adults, which is going to be awesome. It will be, I believe, the 4th crisis center for youth available in the state of Minnesota. Now, some other warning signs. We talked about some behavioral clues, right? Or circumstances, divorce. There might be abuse going on in the home. There could be substance abuse and use, right? Reckless behavior, so to speak. Failing grades when someone, which is atypical if that's not typically how they would pursue academics. Now, other things are statements, which we have both direct and indirect. Now, earlier I gave an example. If someone said to me something to the effect of, I'd be better off if I weren't here, or so-and-so would be better off without me, right? Those aren't necessarily insidious statements, right? But what we're seeing is a perceived sense of burden. And it's important to recognize that usually with a mental health crisis, people feel like as they're a burden to those around them. And that's not the case. We all struggle. When we look at stress, about a third of people are getting along just fine, a third of people are moderately stressed, and a third of people are extremely stressed. So stress is normal. But we all have varying responses to stress. Now I'm going to digress here real quickly. When we look at stress, we all have a genetic predisposition to varying levels of resilience. And our brain responds much differently on an individual level. And so what happens is with our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain right up in here that we use to rationalize, make healthy choices, when we become stressed, that starts to atrophy. And so along with that, our hippocampus also starts to atrophy. Two parts of our brain that really help control our amygdala. Now, our amygdala controls our freeze, fight, or flight response. And so if I'm walking along and all of a sudden there's a loud noise, right, there's going to be a quick burst of adrenaline. Our amygdala is a survival mechanism. But when we are under chronic stress, our prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus atrophy while our amygdala enlarges. And we can experience things like cortisol, the stress hormone, and steroids, right? Other hormonal imbalances. Now, how is this relevant? Because prolonged stress impairs our judgment. We're more likely to engage in reckless behavior, say things we typically don't mean. We're not going to act like ourselves. And so when someone is making these statements, it might be a fair assumption that they're under some stress. And it's important for us to try to broach the subject. Some other statements that someone might say is, I'm thinking about suicide, or I'm thinking about ending my life. And if you were going to ask about suicide, you can do it in varying ways. You can, if you know the details of the situation, you could say, hey, I understand that you're going through A, B, C. Sometimes when people are going through these things, they have thoughts of suicide, and I'm wondering if you're feeling that way. You can just simply ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? Or do you wish you could go to sleep and not wake up? Put your own little twist on it. But there's also certain ways we should not ask. And I want to give you an example before I tell you how you shouldn't ask. If I say to you, or let's say my employer, right? If I go to my employer and I say, hey, look, you're not going to fire me, are you? Unless I really hate my job, I'm going to hope that my employer tells me no. And so we want to be mindful not to say something to the effect of, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? Or surely you wouldn't do anything dumb. Or suicide is very selfish. I hope you're not thinking about suicide. I want to make a note that suicide is not the problem, right? What the problem is that the pain that the person is in. That's the problem. And the act of suicide is the person's solution to the problem that they really don't feel can be solved. And so be mindful of that. And again, if someone's talking about suicide, get someone who can help. Now, some other clues that might tell us that someone's in a crisis is if someone has anxiety or depression and they're open about it. Check in with those people. And I want to encourage you, if you yourself are struggling, please, you don't have to go talk to people about it, because only certain people in our lives are privy to information about us. Now, when I share my story, I'm not being courageous, I'm just being honest, because my goal is to encourage others who are struggling to get help. And so when we look at how do we help peers, right? We want to listen with undivided attention. We want to listen to understand. We want to talk privately. We want to ask open-ended questions. We want to be mindful of warning signs. I listed a few, and there's certainly many more. And I encourage you to look up warning signs as well. And I want to talk about a little bit about building resilience. And so one way to build resilience and help mitigate and minimize stress is to cultivate gratitude. See, many of us, we need something very large in our life to happen. We go to prom with the person we liked. We get hired. We go out on a date. We win the game, whatever the case is. It's typically a large event that allows us to feel gratitude and joy. But how many of us today woke up just simply being grateful? We're grateful for the food that we have access to. We're grateful for the time we have to talk with our friends, to talk with our teachers. One way you can do this is start journaling. At the end of the day, write down 3 things that went well. Dr. Martin Seligman, the founding father of positive psychology, has done this with individuals diagnosed with depression, and he's found that it's been quite effective in mitigating depression. It gets your mind to focus on things that are going well. Now, another thing you can do is something called the morning gratitude exercise, where the first thing you do, this is created by Dr. Amit Sood, is that you stay in bed and you immediately go to your mind and you think of 5 people that you're thankful for, and you send them your silent gratitude. Make sure you're being kind to yourself and others. No one woke up today and said, you know what, I am overly appreciated. If anything, today, at some point, we questioned our worth. I think it's fair to assume that we are all struggling in some way. And when we make that assumption, it diffuses us in tense situations. And so if you get in an argument with someone, if you can assume that that person is doing the best they can with what they have, with where they're at, and that their intention is not to inflict harm upon you, that situation is not going to linger as long between the ears. Tremendously important. So let me ask you this. Who is currently renting space, actually living in your head rent-free, who doesn't deserve to be? We tend to focus on hurts and regrets, right? Fears leading to feelings of depression and anxiety. And so again, making the assumption that others are struggling, even if it's just a little, it helps to have compassion for them, but it also helps to have self-compassion as well. You can also do gratitude walks, where you simply walk around and you pay attention to those around you and you wish them well. You can do it out loud, of course. That might be a little bit odd, but you can also do it silently. So you're walking down the hall and you see some teachers and you just give them a slight head nod, a wave, or a smile, and you silently, I wish you well. Another thing that Dr. Amit Sood has talks about in his book, SMART, Stress Management and Resiliency Training. And another thing is that we want to build attention. See, as we age, we take our past experiences and we toss adjectives onto current circumstances. Oh, this stinks. I don't want to go here, right? And so we tend to lose joy in experiences because we're labeling circumstances and situations. And so I challenge you, look around the room. Have you ever noticed how many outlets there are, how many lights are in the ceiling, how many tiles there are on the wall? If you can seek to find one new detail, at least once a day, in your surroundings, or perhaps in a friend, or even your parents or significant other, whatever the case is, it brings your attention to focus. And when we're attentive, we tend to be more joyful, we tend to be more kind, and we tend to be less stressed. I really appreciate your time, and I'm super excited that you decided to be a peer support and participate in the Green Bandana Project. Before I watch a video, I want to share a little story. So there was a father and son, and they woke up one morning from the hotel that they were staying in, which is right on the beach. And they walked down, and they were walking on the shore, and as they were walking, the tide was receding. And along the beach, there was many starfish. And so the father took a few steps, and he reached down, and he grabbed a starfish, and he threw it back in the ocean. Took a few more steps, reached down, grabbed another starfish, threw it back in the ocean. And the little boy looks at his dad and says, "Dad," he says, "there's so many starfish." He says, "You've thrown back a couple, but there's no way we can save them all." And the father looks at his son and he smiles and he says, "Son, you're absolutely right. But to the ones we threw back, it means the world." The reason I share this in almost every training or presentation I do is because you're sitting watching this for a reason. You want to help people. And you're going to help people. But sometimes when we try to help people, we don't always see a favorable outcome. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's take a minute here, a couple minutes actually, and we're gonna watch a little video. All right, come on, let's go. Let's take a look at some behavioral clues that might point to a crisis going on. Someone may display a loss of interest in previously enjoyable activities. People may appear anxious. They may isolate themselves. They may even have random bouts of crying or be angry and irritable. Of course, there are multiple other ways that this may manifest as well. And of course, we have other warning signs such as verbal clues, which can be direct and indirect. Someone might say something to the effect of, "Things seem pointless. No matter what I do or try, I feel like I'm not good enough." Or maybe, "I'd be better off not being here." Sometimes someone might even have a preoccupation with death, where they may talk about death frequently. And some situational clues. If you see that someone is having a decreased engagement in your social network, or perhaps their academic performance is sliding, maybe they've gone through a recent breakup, perhaps there's a divorce going on, any kind of abuse, trauma, maybe even an unwanted move. Now, don't limit situations to those that I named. Of course, those situations might be evident, but there's a multitude of other situations that may point to a mental health crisis as well, or the potential for a mental health crisis to arise. And so what can we do to support our peers? One of the things we want to do is we want to make sure we listen to understand and not respond. We want to ask open-ended questions. If someone talks about suicide, do not keep it to yourself. We may feel as if we go and tell someone, such as an adult, that we are going to betray our friend's trust. We might be fearful that they are going to feel betrayed. But the reality is, keeping that secret to yourself has the potential to bear greater consequences than you having a conversation with someone out of the love for your friend. And be aware of available resources. Resources may include things such as a school social worker, a schooling mental health therapist, peer advocates, crisis resources such as Crisis Response to Southeastern Minnesota, the Crisis Text Line, and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And what about you and your mental health? How can you care for your own mental health? Well, I highly encourage activities such as meditating, Meditating allows us to become comfortable with our thoughts and emotions and not act on them. It allows us to lower our heart rate, to cope with anxiety. I encourage things like exercise, spending time with friends, talking about stress. You don't have to bear that fight alone. And even things like journaling. There have been multiple studies that have shown at the end of the night, if you go home and you write down 3 things that have went well, it has a profound effect on lowering depression levels. And of course, be kind to yourself and others. I'd be willing to bet that not one of us woke up this morning feeling that we were overly appreciated. The reality is that many of us every single day question our worth. But if we're questioning our worth, it is to take into consideration that those around us are struggling too. And that helps us keep a very healthy perspective. Keep in mind, you are a worthy person. And practice gratitude. There's a wonderful exercise that Dr. Amit Sood has, created. And the idea behind this practice is that when you first wake up, you go through 5 individuals who you're thankful for. And what this does is, instead of starting off with adrenaline and steroids for the hormonal release if we're experiencing stress, it allows us to engage our prefrontal cortex, part of our brain that actually atrophies when we're stressed. And it helps to release oxytocin, the feel-good hormone. And a huge thing is be in the present moment. Avoid excessive screen time. Be present with those around you.